Eventually these are going to be available. Just working on them, as I said. But we're starting off the second half of the course by shifting from Lewis to Tolkien. It's in some ways completely different, and in some ways there's strong overlap. Both men are writing fantasy literature. And one of the things that we're going to want to look at today is what the form of the fantasy is. Because fantasy literature can be described as escapist in its intent. And remember when we looked, Lewis wrote a little work on science fiction, and he described a wide variety of types of literature that are thrown under the genre of science fiction, and said he had no interest in it as a genre aside from that which seemed to overlap with myth and story in the same way that he took interest in the myth of Balder and Norse mythology and so forth. We're going to find that Lewis and Tolkien shared this interest and concern, and when Tolkien writes fantasy, it's certainly not escapist stuff. It's contemporary commentary. It's a product of his medievalism and his interests in old things. It's retelling and engaging with the idea of natural law, which he sees in all things. But I wanted to start off with just a brief comment on his biography. He's actually a very interesting fellow, as many people who are famous are, and not unmarked by tragedy, to put it mildly. But born in 1892 and not born in England, born in South Africa. So both Lewis and Tolkien are not born in England. They are famed for their work with English literature, for working at Oxford University, one of the two ancient universities in England, but neither of them are actually English. Tolkien was born in South Africa. He didn't live there that long, but he was born there. Bloemfontein, and remembers aspects of it, including an encounter with a really large hairy spider, which you can imagine how that would show up if you've read his later works. That early childhood encounter with a really big hairy spider. Born in 1892, dies in 1973, so he outlives Lewis by 9 years. Major scholar of the English language, specializing in Old and Middle English, and is largely responsible for the formation of English literature and its encompassing of Anglo-Saxon. Certainly debate in the period. Remember, English is a relatively new subject of study. In the 20th century, it's being taught all the way back into the mid-19th century, but it's not a serious subject of study. It starts to become one in the 20th century, and so men like Tolkien and Lewis are to some degree forming the contours of the discipline, and they think that the English language and its development is an important part of English literature. And it remains on the syllabus of many universities, although universities are leaving this path, no longer teaching Anglo-Saxon even. But certainly they insisted that it be taught in a historical fashion, that is English literature. And Lewis himself wrote on this. I mentioned this in his address given at Cambridge University, De Descriptione Temporum, on the description of the ages or times. He is talking about different eras of English literature and their development and so forth, or of culture in general. And it gives an apologetic for teaching it historically, rather than simply thematically or in accordance with interest. Tyndale's English degree, it follows that methodology. We go through historical periods, not just the predilections of your professors. The periods are being taught. Going down that path. That's actually a debate within the confines of Oxford University that continues to this day. Most people are against Tolkien and Lewis on this. Doesn't matter a jot whether they are or not, but they are. So he's obviously famous for his Lord of the Rings, but there are many other works, and we're only going to really look at the Lord of the Rings as in terms of fiction, but there are other works that he wrote which in some ways are essential and more important in some ways in his legendarium, which is the whole corpus of his work, like the Silmarillion. Some people think the Hobbit is necessary precursor to it. In some ways it is, but it's just a little sort of side story, really. It's not really foundational. The Silmarillion is. It really lays the foundation for a lot of stuff that follows later. But it's hard to read, the Silmarillion, compared to the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien is born, as I say, in 1892 in Bloemfontein, South Africa. He unfortunately has a very sad and tragic childhood. His father died when he was 4, and his mother and he, that is J.R.R. John Roald Tolkien, and his brother Hilary returned to England without a dad. They go to the West Midlands, off on the west side of Birmingham. Now, there Tolkien grows up on the border of a very grim industrial city. It's the second largest city in England after London is Birmingham. He lives right on the west of that, and on the other hand, to his west is a very beautiful, stereotypical English countryside, Worcestershire, and Severn County, where famous English composers grew up, like Elgar and Vaughan Williams and so forth. But he's on the borders of a very, very rural setting, and yet he's right next to a large industrial center. And he eventually sent to King Edward's school, and moves to a even more pleasant setting in Edgbaston, which is a place where cricket is played now, famously. It's a Birmingham suburb. But his mother, whose name is Mabel, it gets estranged from her family when she converts to Catholicism. So his mother converts to Catholicism in 1900, along with her sister May. This is a decisive point in Tolkien's own life. So he is 8 at this point. And his family more or less disowns them for this. But he and his brother are brought up in the Catholic faith, and they stay devout Catholics the rest of their lives. But he is not, the family is quite poor, not abject poverty, more on the genteel side of poverty, but still quite poor. And in 1904, so 4 years after she converts, his mother is diagnosed with diabetes, which at that time is almost a death sentence because they don't have insulin, and it was. She died. So now he is an orphan. His father dies when he's 4, his mother dies when he's 12. You can imagine how that would affect a young man, a young boy. So they have 2 orphan boys, and they're effectively destitute. They've got nothing. And they are looked after by a man, Father Francis, and he makes sure that their material needs are met and their spiritual needs are met. although they're boarded for a very short time with a rather unsympathetic aunt, and then they get passed on and so forth. But Tolkien is going to King Edward's school, which is an excellent school. He has mastered Latin and Greek, which was the standard arts education at that time. Standard school education, you'd be doing Latin and Greek in school. It was possible then, it is possible now. There's no reason why it can't happen. It's got nothing to do with the genius of Tolkien, although obviously he's terrifically gifted, but that would be standard fare. And also picks up other languages along the way. So he's particularly gifted in language, there's no doubt about it. So he picks up modern languages and ancient languages, among them Gothic. Later on, Finnish. Finnish is one of the hardest languages to learn at all. It bears no resemblance to any other European language. You would think it's Scandinavia, so Finnish, but it's not. It's totally unique. Actually, the one similar language is Hungarian, bizarrely, which is like nowhere near it. How that came about, no idea. I found myself in Hungary many years ago and tried my various European languages on the people there. I thought everybody would speak English or German or French or something like that. Nothing, zero. So I go down the subway, trying to read the signs. I get nothing. If it were in Slavic, I would have got something from it because I could read Greek as well. So you'd be able to more or less nothing. I can't understand anything. I go down the subway and I get accosted by Hungarian, I don't know, police of some sort, and they want a ticket. Because I've come out of the subway, I said, I don't have a ticket. And they said, well, you're going to have to pay a fine. I thought, you guys don't look like police officers. I'm not paying you. And then 4 of them are around me. I thought, well, this is going to get interesting. Got my cowboy boots on. I thought, yeah. Anyways, I thought I'd rather not be in a Hungarian prison. The fine wasn't actually that much. So I gave them the money. Where they showed me their ID, and I was like, okay, whatever. Don't like these odds. Never mind. Total ridiculous story. But just Gothic and Finnish, really, really different from other languages. So terrific gift in languages Tolkien has. So he knows a dozen European languages by this point. And eventually goes to Oxford, but when he's 16, he meets a young woman at a woman named Mrs. Faulkner, who's under whose roof he was living. It's a boarding house. He meets a young woman by the name of Edith Bratt. He's 16, she's 19. They become friends. The friendship deepens. Eventually, their interests become romantic. At that point, Father Francis intervenes and he says, I don't want you to meet or even correspond with this lady for 3 years. And he does that. Does not even correspond with her. Tells her how much he loves her, etc. But they exchange no letters even for 3 years until the age of 21, and then goes on a walking party in Switzerland. Some of the description of the Misty Mountains and Rivendell might derive from those walking tours. The Luthien and Berend, described as a sort of background myth, are often taken, and Tolkien himself endorses this interpretation as a description of him and his wife, future wife. So, and eventually marries the lady and have children together, etc. So very interesting. I don't want to get into the later life. We could talk about his time in the First World War as well. Again, I think that was well dealt with. I talked to that at the outset. The warriors and how much they defined Tolkien as well. But his linguistic gifts and general aptitude made him into a great scholar. He didn't write a lot, it has to be said. scholars did not have the publish or perish mantra over their heads at that time, so they didn't have to, churn out spurious works that nobody would read and weren't worth reading. He devoted himself to, he had a few influential articles. But one of them was called The Monsters and Its Critics, which was about Beowulf. And he argued that Beowulf was an epic to be taken just as seriously as the great epics of the Greeks. And single-handedly, I would say, formed the discipline based on that essay. That's not going to be a subject for our discussion here per se, because it's a little bit off topic, but only a little bit. You'll find it's a very interesting discussion, and he argues for the existence of fairy. We are going to talk about fairy stories in a minute and what he means by that, but he is arguing for the existence of genuine entities that we regard as mythological. And Beowulf is describing real monsters, not just myth. And there's a significance to all that. But a very interesting fellow, again, much marked by tragedy. So if you think about his personal circumstances, losing both parents, and then the war, the First World War, in which he loses all his friends save one, and is blasted, and the whole culture is, the whole of the world is thrown into a conflagration in which millions die seemingly senselessly. His whole existence is marked by darkness in many ways. So his faith, his Christian convictions are for him not just incidental, they're central to his identity. And the role of Father Francis in looking after him will make him eternally grateful to the Catholic Church and those who represent it. And he is faithful to that himself, and is instrumental then in conversion of Lewis and others as well. He was a slight man. This picture of him looks rather more formidable here than he would in person. He wasn't very large, unlike Lewis. He had quite a difficult voice to hear. There are some recordings of him, but he was not like Lewis. Lewis was a magnetic personality. He was big, relatively big man, and with a big booming voice. So as I say, Tolkien modeled Treebeard after him with a boom, boom. That's Lewis. And so we have already seen what poor Lewis did to poor Tolkien, and making, Ransom, the naked, fat, middle-aged man, without, throwing him on a planet. You say, gosh, the things that friends do to each other. But I want to talk about two works. One of them will be this little essay on fairy stories, and then the other will be the poem Mythopoeia. Mythopoeia is interesting in and of itself, but it's really written as a response to C.S. Lewis, and is therefore an interesting sort of bridge work. But in it, Tolkien lays out his sort of theory of poetry. And we can see, and as a result of reading this, Lewis is convinced by the argument that's effectively made there, and says that he accepts Christ as a consequence of this whole discussion. These are true myths, etc. But let's look at on fairy stories first. You can get this in various renditions. This one, by the way, I didn't assign it for the class, but I would strongly recommend and think that you would find very helpful is discussion, his little story, Leaf by Niggle. Not nearly as well known, but Leaf by Niggle is a story about a painter, an insignificant painter. And many people, me included, can see it as a sort of an autobiographical, or at least a reflection on his understanding of his craft as a writer and its significance and its relation to God's creation and God's purposes? How important is the artist in comparison to God himself? Because since the Romantics, at the very least, but certainly long before that, we can see that there are artists that are comparing what they do to what God does. They talk, although the term, I've mentioned this before in various classes, the term creative writing does not exist till the late 19th century, which is interesting in and of itself. Today everybody wants to take creative writing. It doesn't exist before the 19th century as a term. How come? Is Shakespeare not a creative writer? Is Milton? Is Swift? Are these? I mean, they're fantastically creative writings, but they wouldn't call it that. How come? I mean, just things like that are interesting in and of themselves. I think one of the main reasons is because of it courts a comparison with God, the creator, and artists are wary of that comparison. And after the Romantics make that sort of claim for themselves, and eventually it becomes acceptable. Right? They're being creative in the ex nihilo sense that God himself does. Before that, they are artists. They are rendering a tale in a technically beautiful form, but they're not actually making stuff up from nothing. They're capturing the events of life in their prose, and if it's the really good stuff, in their poetry, that will make it memorable, but they're not actually inventing new stories. And so that's really interesting. And further interesting is Tolkien doesn't actually think that he is inventing a world. He thinks he's discovering a world that already exists, which people find hard to believe. But he thinks it, and hence his interest as a philologist in discovering these new languages, which he doesn't think are new, but in fact recovering the roots of languages. So Tolkien, rather, the philologist, the lover of language, is very much interested in etymology. And there's an Oxford book of etymology, by the way, which I have a copy of myself, and it looks at the roots of English words. And Tolkien's work can be seen to some degree as getting to the root of the root. The Silmarillion is the backstory to the Lord of the Rings. And the languages themselves are a part of the root system of the whole legendarium. So it's always seeking to recover what was lost. And it's a very different trajectory than progressive education, which is looking to the future and the good things that will be coming forward. Tolkien is decidedly skeptical about the goods delivered by the modern world. He sees what is good as already having been established by God, and it's his aim as a scholar and as a writer to recover what has been lost and to present it. So when you read stories about elves and dwarves and so forth, he thinks he's recovering the story of a lost world rather than inventing a new one. So there's something, a very different attitude and a different reverence for things that have been already made, which is opposed to the modern attitude, which is we want to escape the world as it has been given to us or create an entirely new one. We want to escape planet Earth as if it were a prison house. We want to escape our human bodies as if they were limitations on our spiritual nature. So this general distaste for embodied being, which is characteristic of the modern period, has been called by many theologians as a return to Gnosticism. Lewis and Tolkien battled the Gnosticism through a different means, through, as I say, fantasy, but it's a fantasy of a particular sort. very much rooted in natural law. And the natural law, of course, contains moral law. So note all the creatures in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, for example, which is what we're reading, will obey the moral law. They understand what good and evil are. It doesn't change. It's not different if you're an orc or whether you're an elf. They all acknowledge it. They judge in accordance with it. There's no changes for all the races and the diversity of them. Hobbit, elf, dwarf, man, Istari like Gandalf is, so a wizard, it's all the same. That's the way the world has been created. And even Sauron is simply a rebel against that moral law, the Tao that Lewis talked about in the Abolition of Man. So it's bedrock stuff. And he sees that modern technology and the scientists and the elites that are promoting progress and the myth of progress are kicking out from under their feet the moral law as if they could do this. And he says both men describe it as sawing the branch off on which humanity stands. And there can be no world that we want to live in where the moral law is not in force. So they see it as a deep-rooted rebellion, a lawlessness. Note that in Scripture, there's a description of the man of lawlessness. Maybe is that a description of our age? The argument could be made, and it's a pretty good case. And so, but of course, things can't be governed without laws, so new laws are created, laws that rebel against the moral law. And I can't remember who it is that said if we don't have, I think it might be Chesterton, if we don't accept the Decalogue, God's 10 laws, we'll have 10,000 laws. And none of them will be just, because they're not governed by the law. God's laws aren't arbitrary, whereas human laws, untethered from God's law, are arbitrary, because they go against the created order which was made by a holy, good God. And Tolkien is going to describe this really in theological terms. I'll get into that as we delve into the Lord of the Rings. But he really presents it as being versus non-being type thing. So either you live in accordance with the way things actually are, or you rebel against it, in which case you live in an almost a shadowy realm. You fall into non-existence. A life of futility and rebellion, but ultimately nothingness. There's nothing there. You cannot live outside the moral law. There's this sort of insanity that goes along with it. At the same time, those that are rebelling against the moral law need to be fought and resisted, lest the consequences of their rebellion swallow up everything that is good. And again, there's a reflection on the two world wars, which are so much a part of both Lewis and Tolkien's biographical accounts. So much a part of them. The two men cannot be understood abstracted from those two world wars. They simply can't. And yet both men are very much in favor, or at least they see no alternative to fighting those fights, while at the same time hating everything that they represent. And in terms of their literary productions, they don't spend their lives screaming against the darkness. They do try and uphold a world of light and goodness and beauty that they think, perhaps, along with Solzhenitsyn, will ultimately save us. Solzhenitsyn says that his beauty will, in the end, save us. Not sure he's correct or not. But beauty, not in an abstract sense, but beauty because it's wedded with truth and goodness. But everyone is moved by beauty. Not everyone is moved by goodness, and very few are motivated by truth. It's beauty that's the effective, the way that we are personally moved. So people say, I don't care about what music, church music doesn't matter to me in my choice of a church, but people will fight tooth and nail for the type of music they like in their churches. Which says to me that beauty matters to people. Because they don't think it's just about beauty, it's actually about what they hold to be good and true. And they always see that. So I'm not giving any ground on this. It's going to be my type of music. It has destroyed churches, in my view. Because truth, beauty, and goodness are united. But it's not just a matter of personal preference. It is actually a matter of debate, discussion. There you go. That was a little off topic. Let's go look at fairy stories. He wants to look at the fairy story as a literary form. Now again, we won't really find this in many syllabi or in many courses in universities as a subject of academic study. A fairy story is a literary form. It was initially delivered as a lecture at the University of St Andrews, Scotland. So Scotland's most ancient university. The third oldest in Britain is up in St Andrews, northeast or the east coast of Scotland, very remote area. In 1939, it was the Andrew Lang Lecture. Now, Andrew Lang was a folklorist and collector of fairy tales, and Tolkien delivered the lecture, and he could have just done it as an academic, but he did it also as somebody who loved Andrew Lang's work. He was very much influenced by it as a child, and so was Lewis, for that matter. So he wants to, he disagrees, by the way, with Lang's inclusion in his fairy books of there are all sorts of other things. So there are travelers' tales, there are beast fables, there are other types of stories. Tolkien has a very clear sense of what a fairy tale is, and it doesn't include everything that Lang threw under that umbrella. Just like Lewis, when he talks about science fiction, he has a very defined sense of what is important science fiction and what he's interested in the same way when we're talking about fairy stories, and you can see the two works as almost parallels. Tolkien thinks that fairy is a reference to fairy, and this is I have to write down because it's some of the same thing. This place of fairy, which is an enchanted realm, which he thinks really exists. And it exists with or without fairies as characters in it. So even though he's delivering the Andrew Lang lecture, he disagrees with Andrew Lang on what constitutes a fairy story, and also another influential writer of the day, Max Muller, disagrees with him as well, which they see, so their view, just to summarize, they see fairy as the natural development of the human imagination and human language. So it's just a natural outworking of imaginative things. So it's a sort of a quasi-romantic view. That's what fairy stories are. They're human imagination interacting with the world, so we create things. Tolkien disagrees. And eventually it is printed, so it's delivered as a lecture in 1939. It's written in 1947. That happens to this day in academia. You can deliver a lecture in public and it doesn't get printed until sometimes years later, sometimes never. Lots of Lewis and Tolkien's works are like that, actually. Still being discovered, Lewis's and Tolkien's stuff. But so it's published in 1947 along with a series of other essays, and they were presented to the other Inkling, one of the other Inklings, Charles Williams. So these were essays presented to Charles Williams, and they will include works by Lewis and others, Barfield. So it's a Festschrift. They were meant to be presented to Williams, but Williams died before they could be presented. They published them anyway, posthumously. It got attention when it was published along with in Tree and Leaf. Now this is Tree and Leaf, and it will contain on fairy stories, Mythopoeia, which we're going to look at, Leaf by Nigel, and then the homecoming of Beowulf's son. I don't even know how to pronounce it, to be honest. And then it gets expanded in the monsters and the critics. The original is 60 pages, including 10 pages of footnotes. So this is an exhaustive academic essay. I mean, it could come out as a small booklet nowadays. So what's it about? What's the case that he makes in this? Now, this is I think the essay is significant because it contains Tolkien's philosophy on fantasy literature. It's embedded in this. So it's one of the clearest expressions, along with Mythopoeia, of and what mythopoeiosis is. So mythopoeiosis. What does it mean to create myth? By the way, the first work that Tolkien brought out, which was acclaimed, was the Hobbit. He intended to write no sequel to it. The Lang lecture that he delivered helped him clarify his own thoughts on fairy stories as a legitimate literary genre. So sometimes being compelled by circumstances to speak to a subject that doesn't seem of great significance to you can alter the trajectory of your own thought. In the same way that you're sort of, I mean, I don't want to draw the exact analogy, but you're asked to write essays for me. You don't want to write an essay. You have to write, but you may find that by doing so, you delve into things that you didn't realize were as interesting as they actually are, and they can change your course. That's what the essay is meant to do, by the way. It's to force you to dig down on something, and you may find that there's something there that is so interesting that you want to go down that path a little further, and that can lead to other paths. And eventually you're digging down, and that's my idea of this, just like Tolkien, the work of scholarship there is digging down into sometimes more solid and substantial things than appeared at first. But he is writing, so he sees it as a legitimate, that is fairy tales as a legitimate literary genre. It is not intended exclusively for children. So they're not just for little boys and girls. They are also the realm of very interesting adult fiction. And you would agree, and I think everyone agrees, although they don't necessarily like it, that The Lord of the Rings is meant to be read by children and adults and can be enjoyed by both. Same thing, I would say, for Narnia. Enjoyable for children, but adults can as well. I am very suspicious of children's literature that adults don't like. If adults don't think it's any good, that's probably because it's not any good. Because there should be a common ground. The Tao in some way should be come out of it. But he is one of the pioneers of this fantasy writing, and his stories along with Lewis's, establish the conventions of this idea of an alternative world or universe. And they become the setting for what is called, the genre is called speculative fiction. And we've already looked at a couple of instances of that in Shelley's Frankenstein and H.G. Wells' sci-fi. These will be classified under speculative fiction. I mean, of course, it's called sci-fi and subcreation. For lack of a better title, I might change it in years to come, but really it's about speculative fiction. And there will be others in that story. So this is an attempt to defend fairy tales, or what the German Brothers Grimm will call Märchen. Let me write that down because he wouldn't. if you've ever read the Brothers Grimm in their original, these are not Disney stories. People are tortured, basically, and really bad things happen. Fingers are cut off, and Rumpelstiltskin, fingers get cut off, and so they're often bloody, and the violence sometimes doesn't seem to even be a punishment per se. It's just sort of there, which I think is sort of terrifying. But he will distinguish Märchen from travelers' tales, like Gulliver's Travels, for instance. So he disagrees with Lang. Travelers' tales don't belong in the genre. He's going to throw out science fiction, like H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Note that The Time Machine is not the same thing as the one that we read. He will throw out the beast tales, so Aesop's fables, Peter Rabbit, Beatrix Potter. These are not fairy. These are just stories about little animals. And he also throw out even dream stories, like Alice in Wonderland. Those are not a part of what Tolkien will call fairy. He's going to be very clear about this. One of the hallmarks of a true fairy story is that it has to be wholly credible. It has to be entirely believable. So note that he said what it isn't. Again, it's like Lewis's discussion on science fiction. There are these things that are called this. I have no interest in that. In Tolkien's case, it's a little bit more pointed than that. These are, if we conflate and confuse these with this, it totally destroys my category of what I mean by fairy. I'm not talking about beast stories or traveler's tales or science fiction or dream stories. Those are not talking about fairy. Fairy is a place, a real place, and the story is entirely credible. Now look at Tolkien's own works. Do they not sound, at least in tone, as if these things could have happened? But I'll quote here, "It is at any rate essential to a genuine fairy story, as distinct from the employment of this form or lesser or debased purpose, that it should be presented as true." So there's no, what Coleridge says, there's no willing suspension of disbelief. We don't need to do that. We don't need to give the artist a little bit of latitude. We are reading about something we may never have heard of, like the existence of hobbits, but once we start reading it, we are believing that hobbits exist. He's going to describe them. You know, that when I first read The Lord of the Rings, I was in my 30s. Most people read it far younger. And when it started off concerning hobbits, I almost stopped. I had to persist. So why do I care about the characteristics of hobbits? Get on with the story. Like this must have been an academic must have written this. This is like concerning hobbits, and they're afraid of the water, and they're like this, and when they're cornered they're like this, and they like pipeweed, and okay, but it goes pages and pages and pages. That's before the story begins. Think, why is this here? If it's a story, it's totally irrelevant to the story. It is. It's a digression. But if they're describing a real entity, a hobbit, I guess it's necessary because I don't know anything about hobbits. So they have to tell me what a hobbit is like. We're about to follow 4 hobbits, and they're going to be the central characters in The Lord of the Rings. So I guess I have to know what they're like, because they're not like people. That's why he needs to inform you about it. He's writing about something that is wholly credible. So then, now I will understand why the hobbits react the way they do in the story. To say from a literary perspective, it's a disaster. But it's essential if he's going to present it as a true, credible story, that I understand how hobbits are inclined to do certain things. But the fairy story deals with marvels as well. It's not just true, it deals with marvelous things. So because it deals with marvelous things, it cannot deal with any suggestion that there is it's an illusion or it's imaginary. There's no suggestion in The Lord of the Rings or any of other of Tolkien's fairy stories that it's all made up. And then at the end of it, they woke up and there it was. It hadn't really happened. Is that in Lewis's works? It's also the same thing. There's a sense that this really happened. There's no hint on the author's part that you woke up from the dream and at the end of it, we're not sure whether it really happened or not. We get that in some of the Romantics' works. So Christabel by Coleridge. Or Kubla Khan, he wakes up at the end unsure of whether this actually happened. Or Keats's Lamia, the exact same thing. Did this really happen or not? Uncertain about that. Here in Lewis and Tolkien's work, absolute certitude that we're describing events that are wholly credible, and nothing in them will suggest that it isn't, so long as we are willing to follow the author in his description. And he will further emphasize that by using fantasy, which is using the imagination, the author can bring the reader to experience a world that is consistent, rational, and at the same time operates under slightly different rules than our own world. So in other words, the supernatural will become a part of that world in a way that we no longer will acknowledge, and yet it's credible that it does so. And for that reason, sometimes Lewis and Tolkien are called Christian romanticists. I bridle at the description because I think that they are, to some degree, there's a reaction against romanticism, but on the other hand, I do see that there are some overlaps. But by going into fairy, and I'll quote, "It was in fairy stories," says Tolkien, "that I first divined the potency of words." And the wonder of things even. So things that have an essence to them. Just like when Adam names things, the things are real and solid and substantial. They have that same sort of sense in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, for instance. There's a presence in them. It's not an illusory world. It's a potent world. And by delving into the realm of fantasy, there's a recovery to the modern mind of that aspect of our perception that becomes shriveled by the industrial world and by the shrinking of sensibilities and the uniformity of our occupation. So everyone gets up at the same time, does the same thing, has to consider themselves equal to everyone else in every possible conceivable way. Wordsworth and the Romantics rebel against this, think that is a shrinking of human nature and human sensibility, and Tolkien and Lewis continue down that path in seeing the modern world as opposed to something good in human nature, and their fantasies are an attempted recovery of that. By the way, when Tolkien became famous in the 60s, it was largely because he spawned a sort of environmentalist movement. And he was taken as speaking as an environmentalist, the cutting down of the trees, etc., etc. If you just think Tolkien's an environmentalist, you're really missing a lot of his work. It's pretty pathetic. Rendering of really what's going on in The Lord of the Rings. There's a lot more than that. So the fairy stories allow the reader to look at our own world from the perspective of a different world. Now, to some degree, I think that's what we do when we study literature, ancient literature, anyway. So when I read Homer or Virgil, I look at the world very differently than I did before I read them. And any ancient, because they look at the world so much differently. When I read that, first of all, if you read a good story, you're totally caught up in that world. You don't want to leave it. But then even when you're finished the story, you come out and you look at the world differently. And Faerie does this quintessentially. And it does so in a way that is restorative of our sensibilities. And our moral sensibilities, our aesthetic sensibilities, our sense of goodness, truth, and beauty are strengthened. So there's a recovery of something that's been allowed to decay or even has been killed off by modern myth of progress. But finally, they provide a sort of a moral or emotional consolation. They provide a eucatastrophe, a term that he coins, by the way. The EU is the Greek adverb for something well done or good. Catastrophe. So a good catastrophe. The Lord of the Rings is about a failure of a quest, not the success of a quest. Ignore the movies. It's about the failure of a quest. Frodo does not succeed in destroying the ring. The ring is destroyed, but Frodo doesn't do it. And there's a great deal of harm that's happened to the world as a result of Sauron's project. And he doesn't win in the Lord of the Rings, but one day evil will triumph over good, says Gandalf. There will come a day when everything will be destroyed, says Gandalf. Whether it's this day, that's open to question. And he's hopeful that it might not be so. But one day it will be so, because there's a trajectory of downward where evil grows in its power and good weakens. That's not the recipe for despair. It's just an acknowledgement of the way things are. They are getting worse, and yet the darkness can be pushed back by small people, even the most insignificant little hobbits and hobbit weapons, which are courage and resilience. And in the end, good can triumph over evil, but it's at best a eucatastrophe. There is not a happy ending. Forget the film version of The Lord of the Rings, where Aragorn is married to Arwen on top of the city, and it's a happy ending and all that sort of stuff. If you read The Lord of the Rings, first of all, the marriage doesn't take place in it. It's in one of the appendices, which is perverse on Tolkien's part. Come on, seriously, at least put the marriage of the characters in. I mean, Aragorn, he's one of our favorite characters. He gets married. You don't put that in the story, man. It ends with Frodo having to leave the world because he's been fatally harmed and can't stay any longer. And neither do some of the other most beloved characters, like Gandalf himself. He's leaving. He's leaving, and is that a good thing for those left behind? Because the shadow and the work of the shadow and evil has persisted. It's scoured the Shire. It's destroyed it. So evil was not destroyed with the ring. That means it's going to come back. And next time it'll come back without Gandalf there. This will be the age of men. What are men going to do against this evil? That we'll find out. That's our age. What will men do without Gandalf, without Frodo, without an Aragorn. So that's as yet to be determined. But so it's a bad ending. Yes, evil's been defeated, and that's the good part of it. The bad part of it is evil's not gone away, it's coming back stronger next time. I'll talk about that more when we actually come to the Lord of the Rings, but this idea that there can be a happy ending in the midst of a disaster is part of the fairy story. And in the end, and when he expands on this in an epilogue, he writes that a true fairy story is marked by a joy. Now, joy is not happiness, but this idea of spiritual fulfillment, which Lewis picks up the German phrase. Selige Sehnsucht, this blessed longing, which is these stabs of joy that come in acknowledgement of God's goodness, and they come out in stories, just as I say, an anticipation of what God will do. But they're never there in our lives as such. But this is the epilogue. Far more powerful and poignant is the effect of joy in a serious tale of fairy. Think the end of The Lord of the Rings. In such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. Now, Tolkien regards the Christian faith as partaking in this joy and fulfilling the mythological aspect of the world around us. It fulfills it, so it's a true myth. So all of the anticipations of that, which we get even in pagan fairy stories, are fulfilled in Christianity. There, God is dealt a catastrophic blow at Calvary, for instance. It's a catastrophic blow. What could be worse? God is put to death as a man, and yet out of that, 3 days of darkness, and then up from the grave he arose. Right? But that's the fulfillment of the very same sort of hope that is in the fatalistic futility, and Tolkien sees that in Norse mythology as well. But in Norse mythology, it's doom and gloom. Things are getting darker and darker, and there's a heroic struggle against darkness, and we're going to hold it back. In the end, it cannot succeed. That's Norse mythology. But Christianity is a little different. And last quotation. I would venture to say, says Tolkien, that approaching the Christian story from this perspective, it has long been my feeling, and it's a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect, as to others of their strange natures. The Gospels contain a fairy story. Now, if any other author would a fairy story, what? Make-believe? No. They contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories, and among its marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable Eucatastrophe. The birth of Christ is the Eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the story of the Incarnation. Interesting, huh? And these myths, these fairy tales of Tolkien, are eucatastrophes that are anticipating those great, true eucatastrophes presented in the Gospels. And so the phrase that he uses in addition to eucatastrophe is subcreation. So it follows the contours of the creative endeavors of God himself and the stories that he leaves to record it in Scripture. Okay, comments or questions? Got 15 minutes? Yes.
Edith Bratt.
Yes.
Dare I ask if her last name is spelled
T's,
T-R-A-T?
two T's.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, 2 T's. It gets helpful, yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you. And Andrew Lang, L-A-N-G?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, then let me move to Mythopoeia. I was hoping I'd have time to actually read it in class, but it's a little bit long. It's written from Philomythus to Misomythus. Now, Philomythus is a lover of myth, to Misomythus, who is a hater of myth. Now, it's interesting because, of course, Lewis and Tolkien both love myths. And yet, it's addressed from somebody who loves myth to somebody who hates myth. Now, he's writing it to Lewis. So what is he saying to him? If you don't see it the way I see it, you actually hate the thing that you claim you love. It's addressed to one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. So there's a beautiful nature to the myth, and yet deep down it's a lie. He writes it in the form of a poem. You wouldn't do this to most people, but to his friend Lewis, who appreciates poetry, why not? I'll read it. Philomythus to Misomythus. You look at trees and label them just so. For trees are trees, and growing it is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace, one of the many minor globes of space. A star is a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented, cold, inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain. By the way, the sort of logic that Tolkien uses against Lewis here, Lewis will employ against other writers throughout his life. So it's, a star is merely a ball of gas. That sort of thing, right? At bidding of a will, to which we bend and must, but only dimly apprehend, great processes march on, as time unrolls from dark beginnings to uncertain goals. And as on page or written without clue, with script and limning packed of various hue, an endless multitude of forms appear, some grim, some frail, some beautiful, some queer. Each alien, except as kin from one remote origo, not man, stone, and sun. God made the petrious rocks, the arboreal trees, tellurian earth, and stellar stars, and these homuncular men who walk upon the earth with nerves that tingle, touched by light and sound. The movements of the sea, the wind in boughs, green grass, the large slowed oddity of cows, thunder and lightning, birds that wheel and cry, a slime crawling up from mud to live and die. These each are duly registered and print the brain's contortions with a separate dint. That's the summary of Lewis's position. Tolkien's rejoinder. Yet trees are not trees, in quotation marks, until so named and seen, and never were so named till those had been who speech's involuted breath unfurled, faint echo and dim picture of the world, but neither record nor a photograph, being divination, judgment, and a laugh, response of those that felt a stir within by deep monition movements that were kin to life and death of trees, of beasts, of stars, free captives undermining shadowy bars, digging the foreknown from experience and panning the vein of spirit out of sense. Great powers they slowly brought out of themselves, and looking backward, they beheld the elves that wrought on cunning forges in the mind, and light and dark on secret looms entwined. And then there's a little star there, which is a pause. There's a break in the narrative. So that's the response
Wow.
to him.
Wow.
And note the reference to the elves that wrought on the cunning forges of the mind, and the light and dark on secret looms entwined. Speaking of these elves as if they were real beings. Then he goes on. He sees no stars who does not see them first of living silver, made that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo, after music, long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth, unless the mother's womb, whence all have birth. The heart of man is not compound of lies. Note the heart of man, the longings, the blessed desires, the things after which we long, and the things from which we derive joy. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combine in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. Yes, wish-fulfillment dreams we spin to cheat our timid hearts, and ugly fact defeat. Whence came the wish? Where do we get the longing? The reason we long for worlds that are better than our own is we were not made for this world, said Lewis. That's why these worlds appeal to us. This gets us from Tolkien. Yes, wish-fulfillment dreams we spin to cheat our timid hearts, and ugly fact defeat. Whence came the wish? And whence the power to dream? Or some things fair and others ugly deem. All wishes are not idle, nor in vain fulfillment we devise, for pain is pain, not for itself to be desired, but ill, or else to strive or to subdue the will, alike were graceless. And of evil, this alone is dreadly certain, evil is. Blessed are the timid hearts that evil hate, that quail in its shadow and yet shut the gate, that seek no parley, and in guarded room, though small and bare, upon a clumsy loom, weave tissues gilded by the far-off day, hoped and believed in under shadow's sway. Blessed are the men of Noah's race that build their little arks, though frail and poorly filled, and steer through winds contrary towards a wraith, a rumor of a harbor guessed by faith. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. It is not they that have forgot the night, or bid us flee to organized delight in lotus isles of economic bliss, forswearing souls to gain a Circe kiss, and counterfeit at that, machine-produced, bogus seduction of the twice seduced. Note the comment on technology and its connection with magic. It's an enhancement of magic. It is a form of magic. It's the worship of magic, technology. Such isles they saw afar, and ones more fair, and those that hear them yet may yet beware. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but oft to victory have turned the lyre and kindled hearts with legendary fire, the Eucatastrophe. Illuminating now and dark hath been, with light of suns as yet by no man seen. I would that I might with the minstrels sing, and stir the unseen with a throbbing string. I would be with the mariners of the deep that cut their slender planks on mountains steep and voyage upon a vague and wandering quest, for some have passed beyond the fabled west. I would with the beleaguered fools be told that keep an inner fastness, where their gold, impure and scanty, yet they loyally bring to mint in image blurred of distant king, or in fantastic banners weave the sheen heraldic emblems of a lord unseen. Now, again, a rejoinder to the progressive ideology of his day. I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends. If by God's mercy progress ever ends, and does not ceaselessly revolve the same on fruitful course with changing of a name, I will not tread your dusty path and flat, denoting this and that by this and that, your world immutable, wherein no part the little maker has with maker's art. I bow not yet before the iron crown, nor cast my own small golden scepter down.
Wow.
Yeah, it's...
Holy cow.
Yeah, and think about the Lord of the Rings. I mean, this is not before the Lord of the Rings, and clearly the battle of Middle Earth is Tolkien's battle. In paradise, perchance the eye may stray from gazing upon everlasting day, to see the day illumined, and renew from mirrored truth the likeness of the true. Then, looking on the blessed land, 'twill see that all is as it is, and yet made free. Salvation changes not, nor yet destroys garden nor gardener, children nor their toys. Evil it will not see, for evil lies not in God's picture, but in crooked eyes. Not in the source, but in malicious choice, and not in sound, but in the tuneless voice. In paradise they look no more awry, and though they make anew, they make no lie. Be sure they still will make, not being dead, and poets shall have flames upon their head, and harps whereon their faultless fingers fall. There each shall choose forever from the all. So that's this. It's a brilliant poem, and it is at the same time a manifesto for what he's doing in his own work. It's an anticipation of God's heavenly work. And it's been given to him as a sub-creator. It's a great gift. Remember when man is made in God's image in Genesis 1, he's given dominion over the earth. Part of that dominion is the dominion of language and the ability to echo what God has already done and called it good. So this is something of the poet's craft, and it can speak against the distortions of it and the non-being created through technology and the devotion to magic and human destruction. All of this is a rejoinder to Mr. Lewis, who thinks that myths are lies breathed through silver. That's how there would have been a discussion they had in the garden of Magdalen College on a long walk there. I've done it many times. Beautiful. But that little conversation changed Lewis's life because he loved these myths. He always had. And wanted to believe that they were true, but couldn't. And certainly of the Christian stories, just thought these were another variety of myth, a magnificent one. It's a great myth, but it's not a true one. Yes, it is, says Tolkien. And in fact, all stories, whatever is true in them partakes of the true myth that is in the gospel. And that just changes Lewis's life. And it changes what he does as an artist, and it changes his understanding of what he's doing when he's studying literature as well, and what previous writers are doing. And it gives him hope in the midst of this technological humanism, transhumanism, which has resulted in 2 world wars, and the loss of and degradation of human life all around him. So that's what this course is about. And Tolkien, I think, he is not the apologist that Lewis is. Like, he doesn't write works of apologetics, but in that little Mythopoeia, there is a better apologetic for what they do as authors than Lewis ever wrote. It's in a poem. People don't like poems. Well, it's even a rhyming couplet poem. So it's profound stuff. It's the distillation of wisdom there in that story. And again, if you want a rather than a poetic version of it, if you'd like a narrative version of it, then read Leaf by Niggle. It's a great little story. It really is. So the difference in Mythopoeia, he casts the grandness of subcreation and the poetic endeavor. What a grand enterprise it is. What a gift to be able to do the same thing that God has done, at least. And note that it's called subcreation. It's under it is wholly determined by the pattern of God's creation. It's moral, and its goodness, its beauty, its truth. Whereas Leaf by Niggle will present how pathetic and insignificant the artist's work actually is compared to living and loving God and loving your fellow neighbor. So it's a really interesting that you put the two side by side. So on the one hand, it seems like being a poet is the most important thing in the world. Leaf by Niggle suggests the artist's work is really insignificant compared to the way he loved his neighbors. Really interesting. And Lewis talks about all his work and says that really it pales in significance to the salvation of a single soul, which is an interesting thing. I mean, he spends all of his life, his talents have been given to this, but he recognizes that when God says that a single soul is saved, there's rejoicing in heaven. It doesn't say when somebody writes a great poem or a great work. Right? So there's not they don't lose perspective on that. And when you read Lewis's biography or Tolkien's biography, these are charitable men who did very good things and loved people around them. And I think that's also worth remembering. But we're done for today. Thank you so much. And again, remember what I said.